a room sealed tight with no door to enter or escape. Welcome to Voice Chronicles. I am your host, Hawthorne. Comment where you're listening from. I truly enjoy seeing it. Now let's open the case together. The Flaxborough Horticultural and Allotment Society had long ago accepted that the annual spring show was more a matter of civic routine than horticultural triumph. Few lettuces of note had been coaxed from the clay of the council allotments, and the roses, though gamely displayed in jam jars and ginger beer bottles, rarely persuaded the judges that Flaxborough might one day rival Wisley. Still, the event was loyally attended. A mild duty of neighbourliness hung about it, along with the scent of chrysanthemums and floor polish. The mayor was expected to make an appearance, which meant the deputy mayor had to be kept sober until the speeches, and the wives of councillors flourished their sponge cakes as though competing for re-election. It was therefore of mild surprise, though not quite astonishment, when Mrs. Winifred Ransby's sponge cake entered, as it happened, under the category of any other confection, was found to contain not jam, but a neat parcel of municipal documents. The discovery was made not by the judges, but by Mr. Scroggins, the grocer, who, out of genuine hunger, cut into the cake with the sturdy penknife he carried for the breaking down of bacon boxes. Instead of raspberry preserve, he produced a sheaf of folded minutes from the Town Planning Committee, the typewritten pages faintly scented with vanilla essence. The incident did not create the uproar one might expect. Flaxborough, over time, had acquired a method of regarding peculiarities as though they were entirely to be expected. Those near enough to observe the finding simply nodded and murmured, some with the air of people who had always suspected that council business was half-baked. Mrs. Ransby herself protested little. A small, alert woman in a hat, whose millinery ambition far exceeded its material, she remarked only that she had left the cake briefly unattended while she exchanged gossip with Mrs. Pedge from the laundry. By the afternoon the matter had reached Inspector Purbright by way of Sergeant Malley, who presented it in his usual tone of faintly affronted officialdom. "Some joker has stuffed corporation papers into a cake, sir," Malley reported, standing squarely before Purbright's desk, as though expecting a reprimand for the baker rather than the perpetrator. Town planning minutes, not the sort of thing one wants sprinkled about in public. Purbright, who was engaged in balancing a paperclip on its point to see how long it would stand, glanced up mildly. His round face held the courteous blankness of a man long accustomed to hearing improbable things explained in grave tones. "Perhaps, Malley," he suggested, "the council wished to make their deliberations more digestible." Malley allowed himself a brief grunt of disapproval at humour in uniform, then added, "The mayor is concerned. Says it's an outrage against civic dignity." "Ha! That would never do." Purbright placed the paperclip carefully on its side. "Better we have a quiet word with Mrs. Ransby, then. Not to accuse, of course, more to admire her sponge." By evening, as the gas lamps clicked and hummed into their duties along the market square, the incident had acquired a dozen embellishments. Some said the papers had contained a scandalous plan to sell allotments to builders from Birmingham. Others hinted that Mrs. Ransby had baked the documents intentionally, either to smuggle them or to shame the council into admitting something, though precisely what was left to the imagination. The Flaxborough Arms reported a lively trade that night, as one by one the town's tradesmen and shopkeepers contributed to a communal reconstruction of the affair. It was generally agreed that the whole business was not at all surprising once you considered Mrs. Ransby's late husband, who had, 20 years ago, been fined for obstructing a corporation dust cart with his bicycle. Thus, in the quietest of ways and over pints of mild ale and pickled eggs, the spring show of 19 acquired its peculiar notoriety. And Inspector Purbright, sipping tea in his office and studying the ceiling as though the plaster might hold a clue, allowed himself the faintest of smiles. He had, after all, encountered many crimes in Flaxborough, but never before one that came served with sponge and caster sugar. The evening after the horticultural show, Flaxborough found itself unusually talkative. By common consent, the incident of the sponge cake was to be the subject of every casual exchange, from the chemist's counter to the fishmonger's slab. It was not, in truth, the most sensational happening ever to unsettle the town, but it possessed precisely those qualities most likely to encourage repetition. It was harmless enough to be discussed without fear of impropriety. It involved the corporation in some vaguely ridiculous capacity, and it had occurred in the midst of what was supposed to be a display of neighbourly virtue. At the post office, Miss Teatley, the senior counter-clerk, confided to a customer that she had always had her doubts about Mrs. Ransby's jam-making. "The consistency, you see," she remarked, lowering her voice, though the only other person in the room was a deaf pensioner buying stamps, "has never been quite what one expects. One year she submitted something meant to be damson preserve that was more like a municipal glue, and now, well, you see what's turned up. It does make you wonder." At the greengrocer's, Mr. Hockaday found himself speculating, in the presence of anyone willing to listen, on how the town planning minutes had reached Mrs. Ransby's kitchen at all. "They'd have been in the council offices," he said, with authority, weighing a cabbage as though it lent weight to his argument. "And unless she has the keys to the town hall, which, mind you, she might, it stands to reason someone gave them to her. A councillor, most likely. They're all too ready to meddle, you know, too ready altogether." The Flaxborough Arms played host to a rather livelier version. Over 2 half-pints of mild, Mr. Dewhurst, the printer, ventured that the documents in question must have been scandalous in the extreme. "You don't go baking papers into a sponge unless there's something worth hiding," he declared, with the assurance of a man accustomed to setting up type that no one would ever read. "I'll wager it's something to do with the bypass scheme. Been hanging about for years, that has, and who knows who might be profiting." His companion, more cautious, suggested it could equally well be to do with the allotments or even the refuse contract. "Always a racket, rubbish disposal," he muttered darkly. Meanwhile, the supposed culprit herself remained oddly calm. Mrs. Ransby accepted the attention with an air of weary tolerance, like a woman prepared to bear gossip as one bears the weather. She told neighbours that she had no notion how the minutes came to be in her sponge, adding that she had mixed the cake in her usual bowl, used her usual spoon, and placed it in her usual oven. She had, she said, been gone from the kitchen no more than 10 minutes while visiting Mrs. Pedge next door. She mentioned this with deliberate frequency, so that before long it was not merely known but insisted upon, as though repetition itself might make her innocence self-evident. In the police station, Purbright allowed gossip to mature before involving himself. He was a firm believer in letting people talk themselves into clarity or confusion, which often amounted to the same thing. It was only when Sergeant Malley reported that the mayor had telephoned twice within the hour, demanding that the matter be pursued with urgency, that the inspector stirred himself to visit Mrs. Ransby in person. The visit was not, at first sight, illuminating. Mrs. Ransby received Purbright with politeness, offered him weak tea, and assured him that she had neither the time nor the inclination to steal town planning minutes. She even invited him to inspect her pantry, which, though meticulously tidy, revealed nothing more subversive than a tin of custard powder of uncertain vintage. Purbright, in his mild way, asked questions about her late husband, her baking habits, and whether she had noticed anyone in the vicinity of her kitchen during the critical 10 minutes. Her answers were prompt, reasonable, and, in their completeness, faintly rehearsed. The inspector's manner suggested complete satisfaction, but as he left the neat little house on Broomhill Crescent, he lingered by the gate, gazing absently at the privet hedge. Mally, waiting in the police car, observed this with impatience. "Nothing in it, sir?" he called. Purbright ambled to the car, adjusting his hat. "Oh, there's something in it, Mally. One rarely finds sponge cake concealing civic documents entirely by accident. Back in town, rumours now began to attach themselves to individuals. Councillor Tudge, who had once proposed a car park on the site of the parish bowling green, was widely suspected of having tampered with the minutes to advance some fresh scheme. Mrs. Ransby's supposed connection with him, no more than a chance conversation at a jumble sale some months back, was magnified by repetition until it amounted to clandestine plotting. Others suggested Councillor Grimshaw, who had interests in property, might be responsible. A few even whispered about the town clerk himself, though in tones that implied the very idea was thrillingly reckless. The librarian, Miss Lucy Teasdale, told her reading group that she considered the whole affair symbolic of moral decline. "When even sponge cakes are not safe from official interference," she declared, "one has to ask what this country is coming to." Inspector Purbright, listening to these undercurrents as they reached him piecemeal, remained serenely patient. He attended his office, signed papers, and listened to Mally's reports without visible concern. Yet behind his mild expression he was sorting the gossip into useful categories: invention, malice, and the occasional fragment of inadvertent truth. It was not, he reflected, the crime itself, if indeed it was a crime, that mattered most, but the way it was received. People revealed far more of themselves in how they spoke of an incident than in the incident itself. And in Flaxborough, tongues were wagging with such eagerness that motives, grudges, and anxieties lay scattered about like breadcrumbs after a picnic. By the end of the week, the sponge cake episode had become less a curiosity and more a puzzle that demanded some form of resolution. The mayor pressed daily for an arrest. The councillors eyed one another with guarded suspicion. And the townspeople, nourished on speculation, waited for some announcement from the police. Purbright, for his part, gave no hint of urgency. But one evening, when the station was quiet and Mally had gone home, he sat for a long time with the town planning minutes spread before him. His eyes moved slowly across the dry lines of committee resolutions, his lips pursed in thought. Eventually he allowed himself the faintest of nods, as though some small but intriguing discrepancy had presented itself. He switched off the lamp, put on his hat, and walked out into the lamplit market square, where the shop windows were dark and the only sound was the clink of bottles being sorted behind the public house. The town slept, content to dream of scandal. Inspector Purbright, however, was already awake to the possibility that Flaxborough's quiet respectability might conceal something altogether less wholesome than sponge and sugar. Inspector Purbright believed, with the calm stubbornness of experience, that the best way to proceed in any investigation was to ask questions slowly and to let people answer at even greater length. In Flaxborough this method rarely failed, for the townsfolk were less inclined to conceal facts than to embroider them. One merely had to keep one's ears open and one's pencil ready, though often the pencil was not required. The important truths tended to be smuggled in amongst the embellishments. His first formal interview was with Mrs. Ransby herself, though he had already called at her house once. This time she was invited to the police station, not as a suspect, but for the record. She arrived in a stiff hat and gloves, carrying her handbag as though it contained her defence counsel. "I cannot think," she told Purbright, once seated in the inspector's office, "how the minutes came to be in my cake. It seems quite impossible, unless, of course, there is some new kind of flour." "That would indeed be a development," Purbright replied amiably. He allowed the silence to linger, watching the little dart of her eyes as she checked his expression for irony. "You mentioned," he continued, that you left your kitchen briefly on the afternoon in question. Did you secure the back door?" "I did not. It is a quiet street. Nobody ever comes round the back." "And yet somebody might." "Well," she admitted, "I suppose so, but who would want to? There's nothing of value in my kitchen, unless they were after the sugar." Mally, who sat with notebook poised, permitted himself a snort that suggested his view of burglars' appetites. Purbright ignored this and asked Mrs. Ransby whether she had observed anyone loitering nearby in the days preceding the show. She had not, though she did remark on a van delivering sacks of fertilizer to the end house and on the appearance of an unknown cat. Both details were offered with the air of significance, though the inspector received them gravely without comment. Having sent her on her way, Purbright next requested the presence of Councillor Tudge. The councillor arrived with the bristling indignation of a man who regards police questions as an affront to civic dignity. He wore his chain of office, though no ceremony required it, and his first words were, "This is all a storm in a teacup, an unfortunate accident, but nothing criminal. We cannot have the public thinking otherwise." Purbright nodded with sympathy. "Quite so. And yet the public are inclined to think it is one of their little failings." Tudge proceeded to explain that he had no possible interest in the town planning minutes of that particular meeting, as they dealt only with allotment drainage and curbstone repairs. Purbright listened politely, but inwardly he recalled that the councillor had, in previous years, shown an unwholesome enthusiasm for any land that might, with sufficient drainage, accommodate a petrol station point. The inspector asked mildly whether Councillor Tudge had recently visited Broomhill Crescent. The councillor, after a slight pause, said that he had not, except on one occasion when he had canvassed there a very long time ago, possibly last year. The next interview was with Mrs. Pedge, Mrs. Ransby's neighbour. A laundry woman with arms like ringers, she spoke volubly and with great relish. Yes, she confirmed, Mrs. Ransby had been at her house that afternoon. They had discussed, among other things, the price of soap flakes, the mayor's wife's unfortunate manner of dress, and the likelihood of rain. She did recall, however, that when Mrs. Ransby left, there was a bit of a clatter next door, as though someone had knocked over a pan. She had thought nothing of it, since Mrs. Ransby's kitchen was, in her opinion, always too full of clutter. Purbright thanked her and asked whether she had noticed any strangers in the street. Mrs. Pedge considered. There had been a delivery man with a parcel, she remembered, but she had not seen which house he went to. She was sure, however, that he had worn a very odd hat. Pressed for description, she elaborated only that it was not the sort one usually sees. Next, Purbright and Mally called on Mr. Dewhurst, the printer, who had been so free with speculation in the Flaxborough Arms. Dewhurst, faced with official inquiry, proved far less expansive. He claimed no knowledge of the minutes, denied ever having seen them before they emerged from the cake, and protested that his remark in the pub about scandal had been merely in jest. Mally looked triumphant, as if a confession of jesting were tantamount to guilt. Purbright, however, merely smiled and observed that humour was a useful refuge. By the end of the week, the inspector's notebook contained a catalogue of small contradictions. Mrs. Ransby claimed she had left her kitchen only 10 minutes, yet Mrs. Pedge recalled her staying longer. Councillor Tudge insisted he had no connection to the street, though his canvassing had evidently been more recent than he admitted. The van delivering fertilizer might have belonged to any number of firms, but no driver had been traced. And always, hovering in the background, was the question of how those particular minutes, tedious in subject though they appeared, had strayed from the town hall at all. On Friday evening, as Purbright sat at his desk reviewing these fragments, Mally ventured his own conclusion. "It looks to me, sir, as though Mrs. Ransby did it herself, put the papers in the cake to get attention. Women like that sometimes." Purbright regarded him kindly as one might a child offering an improbable solution to a riddle. Possibly, Mally, but if so, the lady has an unusually well-developed taste for administrative literature. He closed his notebook with a gentle snap. No, I think we shall not be hasty. People, in my experience, are seldom as simple as they first appear. Let us wait a little longer. Something trivial will turn up, it usually does. And with that, he leaned back in his chair, gazing at the ceiling as though the plaster might oblige him by providing exactly such a clue. Outside, the market square carried on in its usual sleepy fashion, oblivious to the fact that a sponge cake and a sheaf of minutes had quietly disturbed its peace. By the time another week had elapsed, the atmosphere in Flaxborough had ripened into something approaching consensus. Consensus in small towns is a condition only slightly more stable than rumour. It occurs when the same story has been repeated often enough to feel like common sense. In this case, the consensus was that Mrs. Winifred Ransby was to blame. The mayor, in particular, had arrived at this conclusion with alacrity. At a special gathering of the town council, called naturally in camera, but somehow perfectly well known to every shopkeeper by the next morning, he declared that the good name of municipal governance demanded decisive action. "We cannot," he thundered, "allow the impression to form that councillors are sneaking around stuffing confidential papers into sponge cakes." The town clerk coughed discreetly. "With respect, Mr. Mayor, no one has suggested that councillors themselves performed the insertion." "Symbolically they did," the mayor retorted, with the sort of pomp that makes a remark sound more substantial than it is. "And if this Mrs. Ransby woman wishes to make a spectacle of our minutes, then she must be held to account." It was agreed, though not unanimously, that the police should proceed against her, if only for mischief. Councillor Tudge, whose manner suggested both righteous indignation and barely suppressed glee, argued that an example must be made. "It undermines confidence, Inspector," he told Purbright later that evening. "Ordinary folk begin to imagine that we are less than upright. There must be consequences." Inspector Purbright listened with his customary air of courteous inertia. He neither defended nor condemned Mrs. Ransby. Instead, he asked whether the councillors might happen to recall who precisely had custody of the town planning minutes on the day of their disappearance. This produced a little awkward silence, broken at last by Councillor Grimshaw, who muttered that they had been on the clerk's desk, awaiting filing. Purbright nodded. "So they vanished from a desk in a locked office and reappeared in a sponge cake across town." He smiled pleasantly. Quite a journey. Nevertheless, pressure continued to mount. Mally, for his part, became more outspoken in favour of arrest. She had the cake, she had the opportunity, and she's too smooth in her answers, if you ask me. Women like that, sir, always tidy, always polite. It's a cover. Mark my words. Purbright did not rebuke his sergeant. He merely observed, "Cakes are, by their nature, receptive things, Mally. The question is, who slipped in the filling?" The town's tradespeople, meanwhile, embraced the idea of Mrs. Ransby's guilt with enthusiasm. At the butcher's, Mr. Clegg remarked that she had always been too particular in her orders. Not the sort of woman to take a nice bit of scrag end. Always wanted best cuts. That tells you summat, the fishmonger agreed. A woman what turns up her nose at kippers is capable of anything. Even the vicar, when pressed by a parishioner for his view, ventured that pride had often led to folly, and that sponge cakes were no exception. He stopped short of naming Mrs. Ransby, but the implication hung in the air like incense. Only Purbright remained serenely unmoved. He interviewed Mrs. Ransby a second time, more gently than before. She repeated her account without variation. If she was acting, she had either remarkable composure or very little imagination. At the close of the interview, Purbright thanked her and apologized for the inconvenience. She gave him a look of suspicion mixed with relief. Back at the station, Mally muttered, "If we don't bring her in soon, sir, the mayor will have us both in front of the watch committee." Purbright leaned back in his chair, tapping his fingers lightly on the blotter. "The mayor," he said, "has a laudable concern for appearances. But I wonder whether appearances are precisely what this affair is about. After all, minutes do not make themselves mobile. Someone took the trouble to place them where they would be discovered, and in a manner calculated to cause embarrassment rather than concealment." He let this remark drift into the silence, not elaborating. Mally fidgeted, irritated by his superior's habit of raising questions without providing answers. That weekend, the gossip in the Flaxborough Arms took on a note of finality. The patrons agreed that it was as good as proved that Mrs. Ransby was guilty. Some even suggested motives: revenge against the council for past slights, a craving for attention, or, most imaginatively, a coded message to builders about a hidden land deal. The precise details were vague, but the certainty was firm. And yet, amid this growing conviction, a small detail lingered in Purbright's mind. Mrs. Pedge's remark about a clatter in the kitchen. He had not forgotten it, though no one else seemed to find it interesting. To him, it was precisely the sort of triviality that made neat conclusions untidy. On Monday morning, when the mayor again telephoned to demand progress, Purbright responded with polite assurances that the matter was advancing. What he did not mention was that his idea of advancement was not at all the one the mayor had in mind. He was content to wait, for he felt certain that something else, small, almost inconsequential, was about to surface. And in Flaxborough, when things surfaced, they rarely failed to be suggestive. The following week began in Flaxborough with a sense of resolution. To most inhabitants, the business of the sponge cake was considered more or less settled. The culprit, after all, had been agreed upon, Mrs. Winifred Ransby. All that remained, so far as gossip was concerned, was for the police to perform the dull formality of dragging her before the magistrates. The townsfolk were already adjusting their recollections of her conduct over the years to match her new reputation. She had always been a little peculiar, they now said, always too particular about her hat feathers, or too unyielding when haggling over the price of knitting wool. Inspector Purbright, however, was not so happily convinced. Something about the affair nagged at him, a burr in the wool of what seemed to be a neat conclusion. It was Mrs. Pedge's remark that remained lodged in his thoughts, the clatter in the kitchen next door. A small thing, and one a less patient man might have dismissed, but Purbright regarded such details with the utmost seriousness. If they did not fit the picture, then the picture itself must be wrong. One Tuesday morning he paid another visit to Broomhill Crescent. Mrs. Pedge was once again ready to provide opinion, as freely as she provided laundry advice. She confirmed her earlier story, but added, with some relish, that she had also seen a pair of muddy footprints on Mrs. Ransby's back path the following morning. "Men's boots they were," she declared, arms folded across her ample bosom. "Not hers, certainly. She keeps her back step cleaner than most keep their front parlour. I noticed them straight away." "Did you mention this before?" Purbright asked mildly. "Well, Inspector, I dare say I forgot. There was all the fuss with the sponge, and then the council men talking about scandal and such like. But they were there, plain as you like. Size 8s or 9s, I'd say." Purbright thanked her gravely and took his leave, pondering. Muddy footprints leading to a kitchen where a clatter had been heard during Mrs. Ransby's absence seemed to him an oddly neglected fact. Later that day he wandered by the town hall under pretext of inquiring about licensing. The clerk, a nervous man with a fondness for blotting paper, confirmed that the minutes had indeed been on his desk. When asked Whether anyone might have entered his office that day, he hesitated, then admitted that Councillor Grimshaw had called in briefly. Only for a moment, he said, to leave some correspondence. Quite usual, thought Purbright, except that it was unusual for papers to walk out of the town hall unaided. That evening, as he and Sergeant Malley reviewed notes, Purbright raised the matter of the footprints. Malley frowned. "If someone did go in, sir, it could only have been with her knowledge. She leaves the door open, after all." "Or with her absence," Purbright replied softly. "A door may be open without the occupant's consent if she is elsewhere, discussing soap prices." Malley grumbled but made his notes. He was not a man inclined to chase after trivialities when a perfectly good suspect was at hand. The odd detail gained weight when Purbright, making his discreet rounds of the town, heard a curious remark from the librarian, Miss Teasdale. She mentioned, in the course of deploring modern laxity, that Councillor Tudge had been seen carrying a suspiciously bulky envelope in the reading room 2 days before the cake incident. He had tucked it under his arm with the furtive care of a schoolboy smuggling sweets. "Perhaps it was simply a book overdue," Purbright suggested with bland courtesy. "No, Inspector," Miss Teasdale said, with the certainty of a woman who knew the shape of a book better than most. "It was not a book, and he looked guilty as a man can look without confessing in words." Here, then, was another fragment. Tudge with a packet, Grimshaw in the town hall, footprints by Mrs. Ransby's kitchen. Individually trivial, together they formed the outline of something awkward and unresolved. The inspector's curiosity was sharpened further when he paid a casual call at Mr. Dewhurst's print shop. There, amidst the odour of ink and paper, he noticed a sheaf of scrap proofs that bore a striking resemblance to council minutes. Same format, same typeface. Dewhurst hastily explained that he had been printing specimen sheets for the Rotary Club, but his manner was less than convincing. "Printing, Dewhurst," Purbright remarked gently, "is a useful profession. One can produce, for example, a minute that never was, or alter one that was. Quite an art." Dewhurst coloured, muttered something about hypothetical possibilities, and busied himself with the press. By the end of the week, Purbright's little collection of oddities had begun to point toward a larger mischief than a bored widow baking papers into a sponge. Somebody had wanted those minutes to be seen, ridiculed even, yet at the same time somebody else had perhaps wished them altered, hidden, or destroyed. The cake was only the surface of the matter. That night, as he sat at his desk long after Malley had gone, the inspector turned the pages of the recovered minutes once more. His finger rested on a dull resolution about allotments. Something about the wording struck him as slightly inconsistent with the clerk's usual style. It was nothing glaring, merely a phrase too clumsy, too unlike the clerk's punctilious prose. He smiled faintly. A trivial thing, yes, but then, in Flaxborough, trivial things often proved the hinge upon which greater matters turned. Inspector Purbright's patience, though sometimes mistaken for inertia, had a way of drawing more people into his orbit than a formal summons could ever achieve. By the time the sponge cake affair had entered its 3rd week, his quiet inquiries had begun to touch upon individuals who had, until then, considered themselves blissfully uninvolved. It started with Councillor Grimshaw, who appeared one morning at the police station, visibly affronted. He had, he declared, been maliciously slandered in the market square. Someone, he would not name who, had suggested that his presence at the town hall on the day of the minute's disappearance had been other than innocent. Grimshaw insisted that he had merely left a packet of correspondence for the clerk, nothing more. Purbright received this with benign courtesy. "Of course, Councillor. Yet I do wonder, was your packet particularly bulky?" Grimshaw hesitated, then replied too hastily. Certainly not. A few letters only. His expression, however, betrayed the irritation of a man who has been caught remembering more than he intended. After he had gone, Mally muttered, "If he wasn't up to something, sir, why come in all bluster?" Folk who are innocent don't usually bother denying things that haven't been said to them. "Indeed," said Purbright mildly. "One learns more from what people rush to deny than from what they willingly admit." The circle widened further when Purbright called, under the pretext of parish charity, upon the vicar. Reverend Goff was a gentle, distracted man who gave the impression of always being half occupied by a sermon in the back of his head. Yet he, too, had an opinion about the sponge cake. "It is most regrettable," the vicar sighed, "that our townsfolk should see fit to ridicule authority in such a fashion. Mrs. Ransby, poor woman, may have been misled. I have always thought her susceptible to influence, quite without guile herself, but easily persuaded by stronger characters." "Such as?" asked Purbright, in his best pastoral tone. The vicar blinked vaguely. "Oh, well, councillors, of course. They have such robust personalities." Another name surfaced when Purbright visited the library again. Miss Teasdale, keen to prove her vigilance, volunteered that she had seen Mr. Dewhurst, the printer, in deep conversation with Councillor Tudge several days before the show. They were standing by the reference shelves, whispering most furtively. I pretended to dust the dictionaries until they noticed and stopped. Purbright thanked her while mentally adding a line to his growing list of curious conjunctions. The printer, the councillor, the misplaced minutes. It was all beginning to resemble one of those country dances where the figures wove in and out, each partner briefly clasping another before moving on. Nor was this the end of it. A call at the greengrocer's, under the innocent guise of inquiring about potatoes, revealed that Mr. Hockaday had once overheard a row between Councillor Tudge and Councillor Grimshaw about allotment land. "It were behind my stall in the market," Hockaday confided, lowering his voice, though the shop was empty. "Grimshaw said summat about drainage, and Tudge said summat about petrol stations, and next thing, they were glaring like dogs over a bone." Piece by piece, Flaxborough's respectable surface showed the cracks of rivalry, allotments, land values, bypass schemes, subjects outwardly dull, but capable of generating far more passion than anyone would expect of geranium fanciers and sponge bakers. Purbright returned to the police station with his pockets full of gossip and spread it like so many puzzle pieces across his mind. To Mally, who longed for something solid, he remarked, "It is curious, is it not, that so many persons with no supposed connection to the sponge cake are nevertheless connected with one another?" Mally grumbled, "What it looks like to me, sir, is a set of busybodies, all trying to shift blame." Perhaps, or perhaps we are observing the outlines of a scheme too clumsy to conceal itself entirely. Meanwhile, Mrs. Ransby endured her new notoriety with stoic dignity. She avoided the market, preferring to send a neighbour's boy on errands, but she maintained to anyone who pressed her that she had done nothing wrong. "People will talk," she said. "They always do. I am quite used to it." Yet her stiff posture suggested she was not, in fact, entirely used to it, and that being the object of universal suspicion was a heavier burden than she cared to show. By the end of that week, Purbright had accumulated a gallery of plausible suspects, each with their own petty motives, Grimshaw with his property schemes, Tudge with his petrol station ambitions, Dewhurst with his printing press and loose tongue, even the town clerk with his convenient carelessness. All could, in theory, have arranged for the minutes to vanish and then reappear in the most humiliating manner possible. And then, just as the gossip seemed to have settled into routine, a second incident occurred, one that stirred the town afresh and suggested the cake was only the beginning. It was on a damp Thursday morning, just as the town was recovering from the excitement of the sponge cake scandal, that Flaxborough received fresh fuel for its gossip mills. The discovery was made, as such things often are, by accident. Miss Warburton, a retired schoolmistress with a nose for impropriety, had set out early to visit her sister in the next village. As she passed the railway goods yard, she noticed something lying at the edge of the siding, something that looked oddly out of place among the puddles and soot. Her curiosity, sharpened by years of peering over exercise books for mistakes, compelled her to investigate. What she found was a battered attaché case, damp but intact, its lock broken. Inside, after prizing it open with the tip of her umbrella, she saw a thick sheaf of papers, council papers, and not just any papers. Stamped across several in the clerk's familiar hand were the words, "Confidential Committee Minutes." By midday, the case had been delivered to the police station, accompanied by Miss Warburton's prim account of her find. Purbright received her gravely, offering tea as though she had brought him a basket of scones rather than the missing heart of the town's latest scandal. Mally, hovering by the desk, could hardly contain himself. "That settles it, sir. Someone pinched the papers and dumped them. Could have been after the cake business made too much noise." Purbright tapped one of the damp sheets, his brow thoughtful. "If that is so, Sergeant, then we must ask, why hide the documents at all if they were to be returned, albeit in another form, at the horticultural show? And why abandon the remainder in so careless a fashion?" The papers themselves were revealing. Not all the missing minutes were there, but enough to show that some committee meetings had been dealing with delicate matters: tenders for a new bypass, allotment land valuations, and proposals for redevelopment around the railway line. Each item hinted at money to be made or lost by those with foresight enough to act. By the afternoon, word of the discovery had reached the councillors, and with it came a fresh storm of indignation. Councillor Tudge declared the whole affair a plot to discredit the corporation. Grimshaw, flushed and sweating, insisted he had been the victim of malicious persecution. The town clerk, looking even more harassed than usual, claimed his office had been entered unlawfully, though he could not say when or by whom. Purbright listened patiently to each outburst, his mild gaze never wavering. To Mally, later, he murmured, "It is remarkable how swiftly the guilty and the innocent alike protest their victimhood. It suggests that our mischief-maker has struck a nerve far deeper than cake and gossip." The attaché case also yielded another subtler clue. Among the damp papers was a small, torn envelope bearing the letterhead of Dewhurst's printing works. Its flap was sealed with paste, as if it had once contained something more than correspondence. Dewhurst, when questioned, protested ignorance. "Those envelopes are everywhere, Inspector. Half the council uses them for draft copies. You can't pin this on me." His protest, though loud, carried a hint of nervousness that did not escape Purbright's notice. For the townsfolk, however, the drama was more important than the details. By evening, rumours ran from the snug of the King's Head to the pews of the Methodist chapel. Some said foreign agents were involved, others that a councillor had been blackmailed. Mrs. Ransby, who had thought herself finally freed of public scrutiny, found once again that neighbours eyed her with speculative glances. More than one suggested sotto voce that perhaps she had planted the cake under orders from some mysterious higher hand. Mally was inclined to believe the simpler explanation. "It's one of the councillors, sir. Got to be. They've all got their fingers in some pie or other." Purbright, however, remained cautious. Possibly, but if our culprit wished merely to destroy the minutes, they might have burned them. Instead, they stage a performance, invite discovery, and now leave us another tantalizing bundle by the railway yard. No, Sergeant, this is not concealment, it is theatre. And as if to underline his words, the following morning brought yet another twist. The librarian, Miss Teasdale, reported that one of her reference books, the town directory, had been tampered with. A page listing property owners near the proposed bypass route had been neatly cut out, leaving a jagged absence where names and addresses should have been. Purbright closed the book gently, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "Ah, so our playwright continues the drama, each act more intriguing than the last?" Mally groaned. "Sir, if this is a play, I'd like to know when the curtain falls. Folk round here are getting twitchier than cats on bonfire night." But Purbright, though outwardly calm, knew the investigation had reached a new depth. The cake, the case, the missing directory page, each was part of a deliberate pattern. And until he uncovered the author of this peculiar comedy, Flaxborough would continue to play its role in the strangest performance it had ever known. The library incident shifted the investigation from curious farce into something darker. Purbright lingered long after Miss Teasdale had bustled away, his fingertip tracing the ragged edge where the page had been cut. The neatness of the excision suggested deliberation, not vandalism. Someone had removed specific information, names, properties, ownership. It was the sort of knowledge worth far more than cake competitions or whispered scandal. That evening, back at the station, Purbright laid out the evidence on his desk: the damp council minutes, the battered attaché case, the torn envelope from Dewhurst's, and now the library book with its missing page. The sergeant paced the office restlessly. "It's all circling the bypass scheme, isn't it, sir?" Mally asked. "Land values, properties along the route. If someone knew ahead of time where the road was going, they could buy up cheap and sell at a fortune." Purbright nodded. "Quite so. We are watching a stage play, Sergeant, but it is no mere entertainment. The author intends an audience of one, the town itself, while quietly pocketing a handsome profit behind the scenes." The following morning confirmed his suspicion. Councillor Grimshaw stormed into the station, red-faced and indignant. "I'll not stand for it, Inspector. Anonymous letters slipped through my door at night. They accuse me of profiteering, of corruption." He slapped the crumpled note on Purbright's desk. The handwriting was crude, almost childish, but the message was plain. "Your dealings with the bypass land will soon be known to all," Mally whistled. "Looks like someone's squeezing him, sir." Purbright studied the letter. "Or baiting him. The question, Sergeant, is whether Grimshaw truly has dealings to hide." News of the councillor's distress spread faster than the post. Within hours, shopkeepers were murmuring of backroom bargains, and Mrs. Ransby, poor soul, found herself again caught in the tide. "If they can prove it about Grimshaw," one neighbour whispered, "then perhaps she wasn't so guilty after all. Perhaps she was just the decoy." Meanwhile, Purbright paid another visit to Dewhurst's printing works. Mr. Dewhurst greeted him with forced joviality, the ink stains on his fingers failing to disguise his unease. When confronted with the torn envelope, he blustered. "I told you, Inspector, my stationery goes everywhere. Councillors order it by the dozen. I can't be responsible for what they do with it." Yet Purbright noticed a small stack of order slips by the counter. One bore the name of Councillor Tudge, dated only weeks before the minutes disappeared. Dewhurst hastily shuffled it away, but not before Purbright's eye caught it. He filed the detail away silently. That night, as rain drummed against the station windows, Purbright sat with Mally going over maps of the proposed bypass route. Several of the excised names from the library directory were of elderly owners unlikely to resist a lucrative offer for their plots. Mally scratched his head. "So whoever nicked that page wanted to know exactly who to approach. That's cold, sir. Cold and clever." Purbright, gazing at the rain-smeared glass, replied softly, "Cold, yes. Clever, perhaps, but clever men rarely risk discovery by theatrical gestures. Our culprit thrives on spectacle. The cake, the minutes at the show, the letters, all are not merely tools, but signals. They want to be noticed." His words proved grimly prescient. For the next morning, the town awoke to find the market square defaced. Overnight, someone had chalked in huge letters across the cobbles, "The council sells you all." The message was crude, but effective. By midday, townsfolk gathered in knots, buzzing with theories and accusations. Some cheered the mysterious truth-teller. Others muttered about dangerous radicals undermining order. The councillors themselves grew frantic. Tudge blustered about communists, Grimshaw demanded arrests, and the town clerk threatened resignation unless this campaign of intimidation was ended at once. But Purbright, standing quietly at the edge of the square, watched the crowd with a more thoughtful gaze. He recognized the shift. What had begun as petty mischief was now turning the public against its own leaders. Suspicion had seeped from the council chamber into every shop, every parlour. It was no longer merely a game of stolen papers. It was a contest for the town's trust. That night, after dispersing yet another deputation of indignant councillors, Purbright spoke to Malley in the empty station. "You see, Sergeant, the danger is no longer confined to the reputations of a few men. It is the temper of the town itself that is being stoked, and temper, once ignited, seldom stops at words." Malley frowned. "You think it'll come to violence, sir?" Purbright leaned back, his hands folded. "Not yet, but whoever is writing this play has a flair for escalation. The first act was amusing, the second unsettling, the third is upon us, and it is never in comedy that the third act begins." As he extinguished the lamp, the inspector knew the coming days would bring not just scandal, but danger. The stage was set for something far more perilous than cakes and chalked slogans. Someone in Flaxborough was willing to ruin reputations, disrupt order, and perhaps even spill blood to see their plot to its conclusion. The morning mist clung low over Flaxborough, softening its angles but doing nothing to dim the tension that now gripped the town. Overnight, another letter had appeared, this one nailed brazenly to the church notice board. It was written in the same crude scrawl as before, yet its message was sharper, crueler. "The council fattens itself while you starve. Grimshaw takes bribes. Tudge steals your land. More will be revealed." By breakfast the square was seething again. Housewives clutching baskets murmured angrily to each other, while shopkeepers stood in their doorways watching. For the first time, Purbright noticed genuine hostility in their faces, not only towards the councillors, but towards one another. Suspicion had leapt from leaders to neighbours. Who among them was helping spread these accusations? At the station, Malley arrived with an anxious expression. "Sir, we had reports of scuffles outside Grimshaw's offices. A few young lads hurled stones at his window. He's demanding we post constables on guard." Purbright sighed. "That will only lend him the glamour of a besieged martyr. The more protection we afford him, the more he looks guilty in the eyes of the mob." Still he dispatched men to patrol, knowing that absence of action could quickly become complicity in the public's mind. Then he sat with Malley to re-examine their clues. The attaché case, the torn envelope, the missing library page, and now a string of anonymous letters spreading like wildfire. "What troubles me, Sergeant," he said at last, "is the relish. These are not the cold, silent manoeuvres of a profiteer. They are the flourishes of a dramatist. Whoever it is delights in performance as much as profit." The performance grew bolder. That evening, as councillors convened in the chamber, they found a grotesque surprise waiting: the missing council minutes pinned to the mayor's chair with a carving knife. The paper was damp and stained, but legible. Across the margin was scrawled, "This is Act 3. Gasps and shouts filled the chamber. Some councillors accused one another outright, their voices echoing like quarrelling schoolboys. Purbright called at once, studied the knife. An ordinary kitchen blade, sharpened recently. He slipped it into an evidence bag, while councillors argued behind him. Grimshaw, his face ashen, tugged at Purbright's sleeve. "You must arrest someone, Inspector. Anyone. The town will devour us at this rate." "Arrests," Purbright replied coolly, "require proof. And proof does not present itself to panic." Later that night, walking home through drizzle, Purbright felt the weight of watching eyes. A shutter creaked, footsteps echoed, then stilled. Somewhere close, someone was measuring his movements. He paused beneath a lamp, letting the silence thicken. Then, deliberately, he resumed his pace, alert now to the possibility that he himself had been written into this play as the next character. The following morning, the theatre escalated again. A fire broke out at Dewhurst's printing works. Though quickly contained, it charred the storeroom and blackened the presses. Word flew through town faster than the smoke had risen. The letters are being printed there. Though Dewhurst protested innocence, his reputation was ash by noon. Shopkeepers shook their heads grimly. Where there's smoke, there's fire. Purbright examined the scene. The blaze had been started deliberately, rags soaked in paraffin tucked beneath the floorboards. Yet the arsonist had made sure the building wasn't entirely destroyed. Another flourish, another act, ensuring suspicion was spread, but no final truth revealed. Back at the station, Malley frowned. "So it isn't just words now, they're setting fires. What's next, sir?" Purbright looked down at the evidence scattered across his desk. "What's next, Sergeant, is the climax. Our playwright cannot resist it. The question is, will it be tragedy or farce? And how many must suffer before the curtain falls?" The inspector's words proved prophetic. As the week drew on, rumours swelled into fury. Crowds gathered nightly in the square, demanding answers, shouting accusations, some carrying torches, though no fire was lit. The councillors cowered in their homes, guarded uneasily by constables who were themselves muttered against by neighbours. The town had become a stage, its actors driven half-mad by suspicion. And in the midst of it all, Purbright alone kept watch, knowing the playwright had not yet delivered the final blow. The knife, the fire, the slogans, all were preludes. The true climax was yet to come, and it would strike not only at property and reputation, but at life itself. The storm that had been building over Flaxborough finally broke, not in the sky, but in the town itself. By early afternoon, the square thrummed with unease. People no longer spoke in cautious murmurs, but in agitated bursts, arguments tumbling out between neighbours who had lived in amicable suspicion of one another for decades. That old equilibrium of polite gossip had collapsed into open hostility. Grimshaw's name was hissed like a curse, Tudge's shouted as an oath. Even the rector, emerging from the church with his umbrella, was accused of being in on it somehow. Purbright, who had stationed himself discreetly by the iron railings of the town hall, saw the gathering with quiet resignation. He had long known that panic was a more contagious disease than any germ, and here it spread unchecked. A knot of young men jostled in front of Grimshaw's shuttered office, while two women in aprons exchanged accusations about who had first brought the muck to light. Sergeant Malley arrived, hat awry, breathing hard. "Sir, we've reports of another letter. This one stuck on the door of Dewhurst's shop. Crowds are reading it now." Purbright moved slowly, deliberately through the press of townsfolk until the paper came into view. Its scrawl was familiar. Final act soon. Curtain fall. The guilty will be unmasked at the council chamber tonight. That evening's council meeting, then, was to be the climax. Purbright almost smiled at the predictability. Whoever wrote these lines could not resist the drama of an audience. "Sergeant," he murmured, "we shall give our playwright his stage, but we shall also prepare the scenery ourselves." He sent word to the councillors that the meeting must proceed as scheduled. Reluctant though they were, they obeyed, driven more by fear of being seen to hide than by bravery. By dusk the chamber was lit and occupied, though the atmosphere was taut, the councillors sitting stiff as parishioners awaiting a funeral sermon. The public, barred from entering, thronged outside, their murmurs seeping through the high windows. Purbright took his place near the door, his expression as mild as ever. Mally hovered nearby, perspiring with nerves. The minutes ticked. And then the side door opened, and in slipped Mrs. Tudge. She looked oddly flustered, clutching a folder. She advanced to the council table and laid the folder down with unnecessary force. "These," she declared, her voice carrying, "are copies of all the missing documents. I found them, hidden in the vestry of St. Jude's." Gasps rippled. Councillor Grimshaw half rose, then sat again, his face pale. But Purbright watched not the councillors, nor Mrs. Tudge, but the shadows by the window. There, half concealed, was another figure, a man lingering, waiting for the right cue. When Purbright stepped briskly towards the window, the man darted forward, brandishing something metallic. A collective cry went up. Mally lunged, too late to stop the figure from hurling the object onto the council table. It was no weapon, but a canister, an old paraffin tin with rag stuffed in its spout. Flames burst as the rag caught. Panic exploded. Councillors stumbled over chairs. Mrs. Tudge shrieked. Papers flew. But Purbright, astonishingly calm, seized the canister with his coat and heaved it to the stone floor, stamping until the fire spluttered out. Mally and two constables wrestled the man to the ground. The crowd outside hammered at the doors, demanding to know what had happened. When the smoke cleared, the prisoner was revealed, Mr. Dewhurst, the printer. His hair was wild, his face streaked with soot, but his eyes glimmered with furious triumph. "You fools!" he spat at the councillors. "All your filthy secrets, suppressed, denied, hidden away. I gave this town the truth, and they'll thank me for it." No one thanked him. Councillors muttered in shock, and outside the mob howled for explanation. Purbright only adjusted his spectacles, regarding Dewhurst as though he were a slightly disappointing schoolboy. "I fear," he said mildly, "you mistook theatre for justice, Mr. Dewhurst." Flames impress an audience, but they do not cleanse the stage. The council chamber reeked of paraffin panic and the singed edge of paper. The play, it seemed, had reached its climax, but Purbright knew the final curtain was not yet drawn. Too many pieces still lay scattered. Mrs. Tudge's sudden discovery, Grimshaw's pallor, the convenient reappearance of the minutes. Dewhurst had sought drama, but the real story, Purbright sensed, had one more act left. He quietly instructed Mally to escort Dewhurst to the cells. Then he straightened his coat, turned to the shaken councillors, and said with polite firmness, "Ladies and gentlemen, I suggest we meet tomorrow in calmer air. Tonight the performance is concluded, but the truth," he paused, "is still in rehearsal." The night after Dewhurst's arrest, Flaxborough sat under an uneasy silence. Shops closed early, blinds were drawn, and even the square that usually hummed with restless talk seemed subdued, as if the town itself were holding its breath. Yet, inside the police station, the air was thick with purpose. Dewhurst had been secured in the cells, still muttering about truth and purification. His words, recorded carefully by Malley, veered between self-righteousness and wild accusations. But Purbright had not yet questioned him formally. The inspector preferred to wait, letting the man stew, allowing his story to ferment until its contradictions rose to the surface like scum on broth. Instead, Purbright had spent the early hours in his office examining the rediscovered documents Mrs. Tudge had brought. They were indeed the missing council papers, meticulously filed, perfectly clean, and wholly unconvincing. The hand that had removed them would not, he thought, have left them in such immaculate condition. No, these papers had been preserved elsewhere, untouched, waiting for the right moment to reappear. Which begged the question, why Mrs. Tudge, and why now? By mid-morning, Purbright convened a quiet meeting in the council chamber. The councillors shuffled in, drawn and nervous, like pupils awaiting reprimand. Grimshaw looked a ruin of a man. His once booming presence shrunk to pale, trembling silence. Mrs. Tudge sat stiff-backed, her lips compressed, while Malley stood at the door, notebook ready. Purbright opened with a simple statement. The flames last night were intended to distract, not destroy. Mr. Dewhurst believed spectacle would confirm his crusade. Yet in truth, he has merely revealed himself as the instrument of another's design. All eyes turned to Dewhurst's empty seat. Purbright continued. Consider the sequence. Anonymous letters circulate, typed on a machine only a few in this town could access. Then documents vanish, yet resurface at the precise moment when suspicion has ripened to its fullest. Finally, a man of unstable temper attempts to ignite not merely a room, but a scandal, ensuring the whole town is present to witness it. One asks, who benefits? Councillor Grimshaw coughed weakly. Surely, Inspector, Dewhurst benefits only in his own madness. The man's unhinged. Purbright inclined his head. Unhinged? Yes. But not entirely independent. You see, the letters bore a curious consistency. Each was typed with a ribbon worn on one side but fresh on the other. Such a machine exists at Mr. Dewhurst's shop, but he's not the only one with access. Others, too, frequently borrowed his typewriter. The councillors shifted uneasily. Mrs. Tudge's hands twitched upon her lap. And then, Purbright went on, there is the matter of the documents. Only one person here has both motive and opportunity to remove them from the archives without raising suspicion. Only one who, upon seeing the storm grow too violent, suddenly chose to discover them again, in a place where all might see her as rescuer rather than culprit. His gaze rested on Mrs. Tudge. She stiffened. Are you accusing me, Inspector? I am observing, Purbright said gently, that your role in this affair has been curiously central. You raised the earliest doubts about Grimshaw. You provided the letters to others, amplifying their effect. And finally, you produced the documents at a moment most convenient to you. Her lips trembled, but she forced a laugh. So you mean to say I concocted the whole business, that I am some schemer? Purbright adjusted his spectacles. Not alone. You required a hand willing to act rashly to provide the drama you yourself could not risk. Mr. Dewhurst, inflamed by a sense of grievance and easily led, supplied that hand, but the orchestration was yours. A stunned hush filled the chamber. Grimshaw stirred, voice hoarse. Then all the filth in those letters, was any of it true? Purbright allowed himself the faintest sigh. Truth is a treacherous weapon, Councillor. Mixed with invention, it wounds far deeper. Some of the charges were real enough to sting, others wholly false. But altogether they served Mrs. Tudge's aim, to see your influence broken and herself elevated. Mrs. Tudge shot to her feet, her composure cracking. And why not? For years I've seen this council rot from within, lazy, corrupt, deaf to the needs of the people. I gave them a voice. I gave them a show to wake them up. If I used Dewhurst, it was only because no one else had the courage." Her words spilled into silence. The councillors stared, appalled and fascinated, as if the town's very conscience had spoken and been found both righteous and corrupt in the same breath. Purbright folded his hands. "Madam, reform achieved through deceit breeds only more decay. Your methods have poisoned the very cause you claim to serve." Mally stepped forward, hesitant but firm. "Mrs. Tudge, I must ask you to accompany me." For a moment she looked ready to protest, then something in her expression slackened, a resignation, or perhaps relief. She allowed herself to be led away, chin high, as though still on stage. When the chamber was quiet again, Purbright turned back to the councillors. "Your scandal, gentlemen, is ended, but its shadow will linger unless you address the weaknesses that gave it life. Complacency breeds malice as surely as hunger breeds theft." They nodded, chastened, yet already glancing at one another in calculation. Politics, Purbright knew, was never cleansed, only rearranged. Later, alone in his office, he wrote the final notes for his report. He recorded Dewhurst's part, Mrs. Tudge's schemes, the councillor's culpability by negligence if not by crime. Yet his pen paused before the conclusion. For in his heart he recognized the bitter irony. Mrs. Tudge's crusade, though warped, had struck at truths the town would now prefer to bury again. He closed the file, sighing softly. Outside, Flaxborough was returning to its routine, gossip already reshaping last night's fire into legend. The performance was finished, but in Flaxborough the theatre never truly closed. The morning after Mrs. Tudge's dramatic removal from the council chamber, Flaxborough awoke with the peculiar energy of a town both scandalized and exhilarated. The market square, usually a place of mundane chatter about turnips and roofing slates, had transformed into a buzzing hive of speculation. Housewives leaned across stalls, lowering their voices only to raise them again when the next listener approached. Shopkeepers dispensed gossip along with their goods, and even the postman lingered twice as long on his route, relaying the latest rumors he had collected between deliveries. Mrs. Tudge's arrest had become the day's great entertainment. Some spoke of her as a martyr, a woman daring enough to stand against the cosy corruption of the council. Others dismissed her as a venomous schemer, a petty mind who had cloaked personal ambition in the rhetoric of reform. Yet in every telling, her words from the chamber had gained new colours, embroidered by each tongue, until no one could be certain what had truly been said. At the King's Head, a small knot of men argued loudly over pints of ale. "She said Grimshaw stole council funds outright," cried one. "No, no," another retorted, thumping the table. "She accused him of diverting land permits to his brother-in-law. I heard it plain from my cousin who was there." A third wagged his finger knowingly. "It was both, gentlemen, both, and more besides, if you'd heard the tone of her voice." By evening, the accusations had multiplied, to the point where Grimshaw was said to have lined his pockets with everything from public library subscriptions to the sale of second-hand road tar. Meanwhile, Dewhurst's role as Mrs. Tudge's accomplice caused almost equal fascination. The spectacle of his attempted arson, though it had caused little damage, was recounted with relish. In one version, he had poured petrol from a canister into the hearth. In another, he had stalked the chamber with flaming rags like some prophet of doom. A boy selling papers shouted the headline of the day: "Bookseller turned incendiary, council shaken." Flaxborough loved nothing more than a fall from grace, especially when delivered with such theatricality. Inspector Purbright, however, was immune to this chorus of invention. From his office window, he watched the bustling street, noting how swiftly the town's appetite for sensation had transformed scandal into theatre. He had seen it before many times. Flaxborough did not dwell on lessons. It repurposed them as anecdotes. Malley entered, clutching the morning's reports. "Dewhurst's solicitor has been in touch, sir. He claims his client was manipulated by Mrs. Tudge and that his actions were those of a man overcome by stress and moral fervour." Purbright smiled faintly. An imaginative phrasing for attempted arson. Still, it is not wholly false. Dewhurst was manipulated, but his zeal supplied the flame. He tapped the desk gently. "And what of Mrs. Tudge?" "She has given a statement. She admits to circulating the letters and guiding Dewhurst's outrage, but she insists she did so only to expose corruption. She claims the documents she held were meant to be revealed at the right moment, to force the council into action." Purbright leaned back. Ah, yes, the right moment, which turned out to be the very instant suspicion might have turned upon herself. How very convenient. Malley hesitated. "Do you think she believed in her cause, sir?" The inspector regarded him thoughtfully. "Belief is a dangerous garment, Malley. It conceals as much as it reveals. I think Mrs. Tudge believed in herself and in her capacity to shape events. Whether she truly cared for the town beyond that, I remain doubtful." The young sergeant nodded, jotting in his notebook. That evening, Purbright took a slow walk through the town. The lamps had been lit, casting long shadows on the cobbled streets. From open pub doors came bursts of laughter, voices rising in dramatic retellings of the scandal. Children, half understanding, repeated fragments of the tale in sing-song. Even the church steps bore a little cluster of old men, solemnly shaking their heads while secretly delighting in each other's speculations. Purbright paused by the river, the water sliding black beneath the bridge. He thought of Mrs. Tudge, upright and defiant, as Malley led her away, and of Dewhurst, trembling with half-understood zeal. Their fates were already sealed by the machinery of law, but their stories would live on in this place, reshaped until they became parables of Flaxborough's own invention. The inspector sighed. Scandal, he reflected, was like smoke. It drifted, thickened, changed shape, but never quite dispersed. It clung to the rafters of memory, staining everything it touched. And in Flaxborough there would always be another spark to feed it, another performance upon the stage of civic life. As he turned back toward the station, a church bell tolled the hour. Life in the town was settling once again into its habitual rhythm, steady, respectable on the surface, with intrigue bubbling quietly beneath. The great drama had ended, yet its echoes would linger in whispers, in knowing looks, in the sly amusement of a community that had tasted excitement and was already hungry for more. For Purbright, the case was closed. For Flaxborough, the story had only just begun its second life, retold, reshaped, embroidered, until truth and invention were as inseparable as shadow and dusk. The trial of Mrs. Tudge and Mr. Dewhurst began on a damp Monday morning in the Borough Court, a building whose stone facade always seemed slightly more severe when scandal was in session. By the time Inspector Purbright arrived, the narrow street outside was thronged with townsfolk, straining for a glimpse of the defendants, as though a grand parade were to pass. Flaxborough, it seemed, had discovered a taste for judicial spectacle to match its appetite for gossip. Inside, the courtroom was already full to bursting. The gallery buzzed with whispered exchanges, 100 versions of the tale weaving together into a tapestry of fascination. A woman in the front row fanned herself with a programme from last summer's flower show, muttering that Mrs. Tudge looked no more repentant than a Sunday school headmistress. Dewhurst, pale and twitching, sat beside her, his hands folded as though in prayer, his eyes darting nervously about the chamber. The magistrate, a red-faced man who had once run the local auction house, rapped for silence. The prosecution laid out its case with crisp efficiency. Mrs. Tudge had orchestrated a campaign of anonymous letters to defame Councillor Grimshaw, and when suspicion edged too close, she had enlisted Dewhurst to create a diversion by setting fire to council property. Dewhurst, with combustible enthusiasm but little sense, had complied. The defence, for its part, painted Mrs. Tudge as a woman of integrity, driven by righteous anger at civic malpractice. Her letters, they argued, had been a last resort after repeated failures to bring her concerns through proper channels. Dewhurst was portrayed as a simple man of conscience, swept up in the drama of events by his misplaced admiration for Mrs. Tudge's moral courage. Mrs. Tudge herself took the stand, her back straight, her hands folded neatly. She spoke with calm authority, recounting her suspicions of Grimshaw and others. "I acted," she declared, "because no one else would. I sought only to bring truth to light, and if my methods were unorthodox, it was because honesty had been stifled in every orthodox place." Her voice, clear and unwavering, carried easily through the court. Some nodded in approval, others shook their heads, but all listened. Dewhurst's testimony was less commanding. His words stumbled, his voice broke, and he alternated between blaming himself and protesting that he had been guided by a higher moral flame lit by Mrs. Tudge. He described the fire as a symbolic act meant not to harm but to awaken the conscience of the council. His rhetoric, ragged and emotional, drew a few titters from the gallery and a warning cough from the magistrate. Inspector Purbright, seated quietly at the back, observed it all with his customary patience. He noted the contrast between Mrs. Tudge's composure and Dewhurst's fevered nerves, and he wondered at the strange alchemy of influence that had bound them together. Mrs. Tudge had wielded belief like a weapon, shaping it to her ends, while Dewhurst had been consumed by it like dry tinder. The verdict, when it came, was measured. Dewhurst was found guilty of attempted arson, though the court accepted his lack of malicious intent and sentenced him to a period of confinement rather than hard labour. Mrs. Tudge was convicted of libel with the added sting of conspiracy to incite Dewhurst's act. Her sentence was sterner, a term of imprisonment, though not so long as to make her a martyr in the eyes of the town. The courtroom murmured with approval and disappointment in equal measure. For some, justice had been served. For others, the town had silenced its bravest critic. By evening, the pubs were full again, retelling the trial with embellishments so vivid that one could almost believe Mrs. Tudge had stood upon the bench and denounced the entire borough before being dragged away in chains. As the crowd dispersed, Purbright lingered in the square, watching the townsfolk stream homeward. He felt no triumph, no satisfaction, only the familiar recognition that Flaxborough's dramas always ended in the same way, with gossip transmuted into legend, with truth blurred beyond recognition. Malley joined him, tugging his coat against the drizzle. "Do you think she'll be remembered, sir?" he asked. Purbright gave a small smile. "Oh, yes, Malley. Remembered, certainly, but not as she was. In time, she'll become whatever story the town prefers to tell. Part warning, part entertainment. Perhaps even a heroine in some versions." The young sergeant frowned. "And Dewhurst?" "He will fade, I suspect. Supporting players usually do." The bell of the town hall clock chimed the hour. The square grew quiet, save for the slap of rain against the cobbles. Purbright turned towards the station, his thoughts heavy yet resigned. In Flaxborough, justice had been done, or at least a verdict had been reached. The town would move on, restless for its next scandal, its next tale to embroider. And in the shadows, beneath the respectable facades and neatly drawn curtains, new intrigues were no doubt already stirring, waiting for their turn upon the stage.